The courtyard at Landsberg Prison, Bavaria, April 1924. Adolf Hitler, age 34, national humiliation, fresh from his failed Beer Hall Putsch, steps out of the armored transport, still wearing his civilian trial suit. Above, 20 prisoners watch from barred windows. Prison officials process the celebrity traitor. In the courtyard, detail line stands Ernst Toller, Jewish playwright, imprisoned for socialist activities. Hitler recognizes him from Munich intellectual circles. Without warning, Hitler removes his right leather glove and strikes Toller across the face. The guards freeze. No protocol exists for famous prisoners assaulting each other. Toller doesn't flinch. He says something quietly, just 6 words. Hitler's face changes. Witnesses later report visible emotion, something between rage and grief. The glove falls to the cobblestones. In the next 36 hours, Hitler's cellmate will document uncharacteristic behavior. What did Toller say in that moment? And why did it make Germany's most defiant orator cry? Landsberg wasn't a dungeon. It was a fortress converted into what the German press called a celebrity prison. Relatively comfortable, visitors allowed, meals decent. For political prisoners, especially famous ones, it functioned more like exile than punishment. Hitler arrived on April 8, 1924, 8 days after his sentencing. His trial had been a spectacle. He'd turned treason charges into a nationalist platform, spoke for hours, and walked away with just 5 years. Everyone knew he'd serve a fraction of that. Outside, his supporters still rallied. Inside, the man looked smaller than his reputation. Ernst Toller was already there. Age 30, Jewish, a decorated WWI veteran who'd won the Iron Cross, then became a pacifist and playwright. His anti-war plays were celebrated across Germany. In 1919, he'd helped lead the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic, a doomed socialist experiment crushed by right-wing forces. Now he sat in Landsberg for his role in that failed revolution, writing, reading, mostly keeping to himself. The two men represented opposite Germanys. Toller, intellectual, humanist, haunted by the war he'd fought and the ideals he'd lost. Hitler, vengeful, mythologizing, building a narrative where betrayal and conspiracy explained every failure. They'd moved in overlapping circles in Munich, same cafes, same political meetings, though on violently opposed sides. They knew of each other. What they didn't yet know was how their pasts were closer than either realized. The courtyard incident happened during a routine prisoner work detail. Toller was carrying tools. Hitler, fresh off the transport, saw him and something snapped. Witnesses described it as sudden. No argument, no provocation. Just the glove coming off, the slap, the sound echoing off stone walls. Then Toller's response, too quiet for guards to hear. And Hitler's face, crumpling. One prisoner later told his family, "I thought the man might weep right there." Rudolf Hess became Hitler's cellmate by choice. Fanatically loyal, Hess had participated in the Beer Hall Putsch and received his own sentence. He viewed sharing a cell with Hitler as an honor, a chance to serve the man he believed would reshape Germany. Hess kept notes, personal observations, fragments of conversations. In those notes, dated April 9th 10, 1924, he documented something unusual. He refuses meals, sits at the desk, stares at that glove for hours, won't speak of what happened in the courtyard. I asked once. He told me to be silent. He writes letters, then burns them in the small stove. I watched 3 sheets go to ash this morning. Toller, meanwhile, maintained his routine. He wrote in his cell, received visitors, mostly fellow socialists and writers, and participated in prison programs. Other inmates respected him. Even guards, some of whom had fought in the war, acknowledged his military service. When asked about the incident by a fellow prisoner, Toller's response was simple. I reminded him of something. That's all. The paradox gnawed at Hess. Why would Toller's words affect Hitler so profoundly? These weren't ideological opponents debating in a courtroom. This was something personal, something that bypassed all of Hitler's rhetorical armor. Landsberg's stone walls held more than criminals. It held men whose lives intersected with Germany's trauma, the war, the revolution, the collapse of the old order. Hitler and Toller both carried 1914-1918 inside them, but they'd processed it in opposite directions. Toller had emerged broken by the violence, dedicated to preventing it. Hitler had emerged inflamed by the defeat, dedicated to avenging it. But in April 1924, inside that fortress, something connected them that neither man's public identity could accommodate. Hess saw it, but didn't understand it. The other prisoners sensed it. The guards noted it in their logs. And Hitler, alone with his glove and his burning letters, was trying desperately to make it disappear. The 36 hours stretched. April 9th became April 10th. Hitler refused his usual visitors, supporters who'd traveled to Landsberg, hoping to see the man they believed would rise again. He sat at the small wooden desk, the glove in front of him like evidence in a trial. Hess watched, uncertain whether to intervene or stay silent. Loyalty demanded silence. Outside Hitler's cell, the prison continued. Toller attended a discussion group on literature. He ate meals with other political prisoners. He showed no sign of distress, no concern about retaliation. If anything, he seemed unburdened, as if he'd discharged a responsibility. One guard, in a later private letter to his brother, described the atmosphere. The famous one, Hitler. He's locked himself away, won't eat. The Jewish writer Toller, he's calm as Sunday morning. Strange business. 20 men saw what happened, and not one will say what it means. The prison officials noted uncharacteristic withdrawal in Hitler's file. This was a man who'd spent his trial performing for crowds, who'd turned his sentencing into a political victory. Now, he couldn't face a single visitor. The glove sat there, a physical anchor to something he couldn't control. Late on April 10th, Hess later wrote, Hitler finally spoke. Some truths, Rudolf, are unbearable not because they're false, but because they're true. Then he returned to silence. That night, another letter went into the stove. Hess glimpsed a few words before the flames took them. You remember what I was? The rest turned to ash. What was Hitler trying to erase? The public version of himself, the orator, the leader, the man of iron will, allowed no room for vulnerability, for having been saved, for owing debts he couldn't repay or acknowledge. The glove had become a symbol of his attempt to strike that vulnerability away. It hadn't worked. By April 11th, he resumed normal activity. The crisis, at least visibly, had passed. But something had shifted. Hess began his quiet investigation. Who exactly was Ernst Toller? He knew the basics: playwright, socialist, Jew. But those labels didn't explain Hitler's reaction. So Hess asked around carefully. He spoke with prisoners who'd known Toller before Landsberg, with guards who'd processed his intake, with anyone who might offer insight. One detail emerged: Toller's war record. Iron Cross, First Class, Bavarian Division, served 1914-1916 on the Western Front before a medical discharge. Hess noted this carefully. Hitler had also served on the Western Front, 16th Bavarian Reserve Regiment, 1914 to 1918. Same army, same region, overlapping time frames. Hess's mind moved to the obvious question: had they known each other during the war? There was no documentation of a meeting. Military records listed regiments, battles, injuries, but not every personal interaction between soldiers. The Western Front was chaos. Men rotated through field hospitals, supply depots, reserve trenches. Thousands of soldiers crossed paths without formal record. But proximity was real. Both men had been at the Somme in 1916. Both had been near Fromelles. The geography of war placed them in the same theater, the same nightmare at the same time. Hess didn't approach Hitler with this information. Loyalty meant understanding when to probe and when to protect. Instead, he filed it away, a piece of the puzzle that didn't yet fit. Meanwhile, Toller continued his routine, unbothered. When a fellow prisoner, another socialist, a man named Friedrich, asked him directly about the courtyard incident, Toller's response was measured. I simply told him the truth. He didn't want to hear it. What truth? Friedrich pressed. Toller smiled, a sad smile. That we were once the same, just soldiers, just scared boys trying not to die. Friedrich didn't understand, but he didn't push further. Toller had a way of ending conversations when he wanted to. Hess, listening from across the common area, heard enough. The pieces were aligning, but the picture was still incomplete. Ernst Toller's story ran counter to every narrative Hitler was building. Born into a Jewish family in Prussia, Toller had volunteered for the German army in August 1914, swept up in the same patriotic fervor that gripped millions. He believed in Germany, fought for Germany, bled for Germany. The trenches changed him. He saw men obliterated by artillery, drowned in mud, driven mad by the endless noise. He watched the initial idealism curdle into mechanized slaughter. By 1916, recovering from shrapnel wounds, Toller began writing. Poems first, then plays, processing the trauma through language. After the war, he threw himself into politics. The Bavarian Soviet Republic of 1919 was brief, chaotic, doomed. When it collapsed, Toller was sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg. He used the time to write more, to refine his craft. His plays, Transformation, Masses and Man, were performed across Germany, celebrated for their humanism and anti-war stance. The irony was sharp. Toller had volunteered to defend Germany. Hitler called Jews inherently non-German, incapable of true loyalty. Yet here was Toller, Iron Cross recipient, willing to die for a country that would soon turn on him entirely. Hess compiled this information piece by piece. He read reviews of Toller's plays in smuggled newspapers. He spoke with prisoners who'd seen the productions. He began to understand why Hitler might hate Toller, not just for his politics, but for what his existence represented. Toller was a living contradiction to Hitler's racial ideology. But that still didn't explain the tears. Ideology creates rage, not grief. Hess was missing something deeper, something rooted not in ideas, but in experience. He returned to the war records, studying maps, battle dates, troop movements. The overlap was undeniable. Hitler and Toller had been in the same sector at the same time during some of the war's worst fighting. And then Hess found a reference, almost buried: field hospital rotations near Fromelles, July 1916. Both men's medical records showed treatment there within days of each other. Had they met? July 1916. The Battle of Fromelles, a British and Australian assault on German positions, a disaster that left thousands dead in hours. The German defenders held, but at cost. Field hospitals behind the lines overflowed with wounded. Men lay on cots, in hallways, outside in the summer heat. The smell of blood, antiseptic and gangrene mixed with the distant thunder of artillery. Ernst Toller, age 22, recovered from shrapnel wounds to his leg and shoulder. Doctors said he was lucky. No major arteries hit, bones intact. He'd be discharged within weeks, sent home for convalescence. He lay in a field hospital tent, staring at canvas, trying not to think about the men who hadn't made it out. Adolf Hitler, age 27, was in the same hospital complex, treated for a minor leg wound. Not serious enough to send him home, just enough to pull him off the front for a few days. He was terrified. Despite later mythologizing his war service, the early Hitler was often paralyzed by fear. Documented by fellow soldiers, noted in unofficial accounts. He'd volunteered out of desperation for purpose, but the reality of trench warfare stripped away illusions fast. Did they meet? The official record is silent. But field hospitals were small worlds. Men shared rations, cigarettes, stories. They talked to pass the time, to forget where they were. Years later, in a fragment from Toller's private writings, published posthumously, there's a single mention. I remember a young soldier, Austrian accent, weeping quietly at night. I shared my bread with him. We didn't exchange names. It didn't seem important then. And in the letter Hitler burned in Landsberg, the fragment Hess glimpsed. You remember what Hitler was. A terrified soldier. Saved from despair by a small act of kindness from a man he would later demonize. Toller's 6 words in the courtyard weren't a threat. They were a reminder. You've forgotten Fromelles. I haven't. Hitler remembered. That was the problem. Hess found the burned letter fragment on April 11th while cleaning the small stove in their cell. Hitler had stepped out for exercise. Hess, ever meticulous, emptied the ash and noticed the partially intact scrap of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. Hitler's tight, controlled script. You remember what I was... The sentence ended there, consumed by fire. Hess held the fragment carefully, debating whether to confront Hitler. Loyalty won. He placed it in his own notes, hidden away. That afternoon, Hess encountered Toller in the prison library. It wasn't planned. Toller was reading Goethe. Hess was retrieving a book for Hitler. They acknowledged each other with nods. Then Hess, emboldened by curiosity, spoke. What did you say to him? In the courtyard? Toller looked up, calm. I reminded him of something he'd prefer to forget. What? That he was once human, vulnerable, helped by someone he now calls his enemy. Hess stiffened. You're lying. Toller closed his book. I have no reason to lie. And he knows I'm telling the truth. That's why it hurt. Hess wanted to argue, to defend Hitler's ideology. But something in Toller's tone, sad, almost pitying, stopped him. This wasn't a political argument. This was something older, more personal. He'll bury this, Toller continued. He'll write it out of his story. Men like him always do. But it happened, and I was there. Hess left without another word. Back in the cell, he stared at the fragment again. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was unbearable. For Hitler, and now for Hess. If Toller was telling the truth, if Hitler had once been saved by a Jewish soldier, then the entire ideological structure Hitler was building, the racial hierarchy, the demonization, the myth of Aryan superiority, was built on a foundation that included a Jewish man's kindness. No wonder Hitler wept. No wonder he burned letters. The truth wasn't just inconvenient, it was annihilating. The whisper network inside Landsberg moved slowly, but it moved. Prisoners talked, guards gossiped. By mid-April, nearly everyone in the fortress had heard some version of the courtyard incident. Details varied. Some said Hitler had attacked Toller over politics, others over a personal insult. But the core remained consistent. Hitler struck Toller. Toller responded with words. Hitler broke. One guard, in a letter later discovered in archives, wrote, "I've seen men crack before. Prison does that. But this was different." It was like watching someone realize they'd built their whole life on sand. Another prisoner, a socialist named Werner, later told his family, Toller didn't gloat. He didn't mock. If anything, he seemed sad about it, like he'd delivered news of a death. Hitler resumed his normal schedule: visitors, discussions with Hess, the beginnings of what would become Mein Kampf. But those who knew him noticed changes. He was more controlled, more deliberate. The manic energy from the trial was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculated. Hess watched Hitler write. Pages accumulated, rants about betrayal, race, destiny. The manuscript was obsessive, repetitive, circling the same themes: purity, contamination, the need for absolute ideological clarity. Hess understood what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a political manifesto. It was therapy. Hitler was writing himself into a version of reality where Toller's reminder couldn't exist. Toller, when asked by a fellow inmate about Hitler's writing, shrugged. Let him write. Words on paper can't change what happened. But Toller underestimated the power of narrative. Hitler was constructing a mythology so totalizing, so all-encompassing, that it would overwrite inconvenient truths. The scared soldier in the field hospital would vanish. The man who'd been helped by a Jew would be erased. In their place, the Führer, the vision, the destiny. The glove, meanwhile, disappeared. Hess never saw it again after mid-April. Whether Hitler destroyed it, hid it, or simply lost it, no one knows. But its symbolic weight remained. Late April 1924. Ernst Toller sat in the prison courtyard with Friedrich, the fellow socialist who'd asked about the incident weeks earlier. The weather had warmed. Birds sang in the trees beyond the walls. Toller was in good spirits. His latest play had been performed in Berlin to strong reviews, news that reached him through letters. Friedrich pressed again. "You've never told me the full story. What did you say to him?" Toller considered. Then, quietly, he spoke. Fromelles, 1916. I was in a field hospital, recovering from shrapnel. There was a young soldier, Austrian, terrified, weeping at night. Nightmares, probably. Shock. I felt sorry for him. I gave him some of my rations, talked to him a bit. Just small comforts. We didn't exchange names. It was war. Everyone was a stranger. Friedrich listened, intent. I didn't think of it again, not for years. Then in the courtyard, I saw him, older, harder, but the same face. I recognized him immediately, and I realized he'd built his entire ideology on the idea that people like me are subhuman, incapable of loyalty, courage, kindness. And yet, when he was most vulnerable, it was one of us who helped him. So you told him? Toller nodded. I said, "You've forgotten Fromelles." "I haven't." "That's all. 6 words." Friedrich exhaled slowly. "And he struck you." "Yes." "Because what else could he do? Acknowledge it? That would destroy everything he's building." So he tried to silence it with violence. But violence doesn't erase truth. And his reaction afterward? Toller's expression softened. Grief. Real grief. Because somewhere, deep down, he remembers. He remembers being that scared boy, and he hates that version of himself. So he's trying to kill it with words, with ideology, with hate. Friedrich sat silent for a long moment. Then, "You should tell this story. Publicly." Toller shook his head. "No, it won't matter. Men like him, they rewrite history, and people believe the rewrite." He was right. The mechanics of forgetting are precise. Hitler's 36-hour isolation wasn't random collapse. It was deliberate psychological labor. He was constructing a new version of himself, one that couldn't accommodate being saved by a Jew. The letters he burned were drafts of that reconstruction, attempts to articulate a self-image that had no room for Fromelles, for vulnerability, for gratitude. The glove became a focal point because it represented the moment his control slipped. He'd tried to reassert dominance through violence, and it had backfired. Toller hadn't fought back. He'd simply spoken the truth, and truth, delivered calmly, is harder to fight than any physical blow. Hess watched the transformation. Hitler emerged from those 36 hours different, more rigid, more ideological, less human. The writing that poured out of him in the following months was manic in its certainty. Mein Kampf would eventually span hundreds of pages, and in all those pages, there is no mention of doubt, of complexity, of ever having been helped by someone he later demonized. The manuscript became a fortress, just as Landsberg's stone walls were a fortress. Inside it, Hitler was safe from Toller's reminder. Inside it, he was the hero, the visionary, the victim of Jewish conspiracy. The scared soldier weeping in a field hospital simply didn't exist in that version. Toller, for his part, never spoke of the incident publicly. He was released from Landsberg later in 1924, resumed his writing career, and watched with growing horror as Hitler's movement gained power. By the early 1930s, Toller was in exile, his plays banned, his citizenship revoked, his life threatened. In 1939, as Germany invaded Poland and the war Toller had feared became reality, he took his own life in a New York hotel room. He was 45. Among his papers, found after his death, were notes from Landsberg. One line read, "I told him the truth. It changed nothing." He was right. The truth had cracked Hitler for 36 hours. But cracks can be filled, and Hitler filled his with ideology, hate, and power. The logistics of memory suppression are brutal. Hitler couldn't erase what happened, so he built over it. Every speech, every rally, every page of Mein Kampf was another layer of concrete poured over Fromelles. The more he repeated the ideology, the more real it became. Not because it was true, but because repetition creates its own reality. The 20 witnesses to the courtyard incident scattered. Some became Nazis, rising through the party ranks. Others emigrated, fled, or fell silent. None ever publicly reported what they'd seen. In Nazi Germany, contradicting the Führer's mythology was suicidal. Hess remained loyal. He never mentioned the burned letters, never asked about Toller again. In 1941, he would fly solo to Scotland on a bizarre peace mission, be captured, and spend the rest of his life in prison. Among his personal effects, found decades later, were old notes from Landsberg. The fragment about the glove was there, but no explanation accompanied it. Toller's exile years were productive but haunted. He wrote, he spoke against fascism. He warned anyone who would listen. But he was one voice among many, and the world was slow to act. When he died in 1939, his obituaries mentioned his plays, his politics, his exile. None mentioned Landsberg or Hitler, or what he'd told a future dictator in a prison courtyard. The glove itself, last seen in Hitler's cell in mid-April 1924, vanished from history. Whether destroyed, discarded, or hidden, it left no trace. Objects don't carry memory the way humans do, but for those 36 hours, it had been a symbol of violence, of vulnerability, of the unbearable truth that ideology tries to bury. By the time Hitler seized power in 1933, Fromelles was ancient history. The field hospital was long gone, the soldiers scattered or dead, the records incomplete. The boy who'd wept and been comforted by a Jewish soldier had been replaced by the Führer, untouchable, mythologized, absolute. But some truths don't disappear. They just wait. The immediate fallout was silence. Landsberg's inmates knew better than to speak. Toller was released in December 1924, having served his sentence. He returned to writing, to theater, to activism, but within a Germany that was shifting beneath his feet. By 1933, he was gone, first to Switzerland, then England, finally America. Hitler was released even sooner on December 20th, 1924, after serving just over 8 months. He emerged to a changed political landscape, but with Mein Kampf nearly complete. The book, published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926, laid out his vision. Racial purity, German destiny, the Jewish threat. Nowhere in its pages is there room for nuance, for gratitude, for the complicated reality of having been helped by the enemy. The 20 witnesses dispersed. Some became ardent Nazis, true believers in the ideology Hitler sold. Others faded into private life, uncomfortable with what they'd seen, but unwilling to speak. In Nazi Germany, such silence was survival. Hess never confronted Hitler about the incident. Loyalty meant protecting the myth, even when you knew the truth beneath it. He would follow Hitler into war, into madness, into ruin. The glove was never found. No inventory listed it. No museum holds it. It exists now only in this story, a small object carrying enormous weight. Toller's death in 1939 went largely unnoticed outside literary circles. The world was focused on war. His plays, once celebrated, were forgotten in Germany for decades. The story of Fromelles, of the courtyard, of the 6 words that made a future dictator weep, died with him, or almost died, because stories have a way of surviving, fragments at a time. A guard's letter here, a prisoner's memoir there, a burned scrap of paper preserved in Hess's notes, enough to piece together what happened in April 1924, enough to know that for 36 hours, the man who would terrorize Europe couldn't escape the memory of being human, And the cost of that memory was a lifetime of denial. 1939. Ernst Toller, alone in a New York hotel room, writes a final letter. He doesn't mention Landsberg directly. He doesn't need to. The war he feared, the darkness he warned against, has arrived. His plays, his words, his life's work, none of it stopped what was coming. In Europe, Hitler is unstoppable. The ideology that began in a Landsberg cell, written obsessively to overwrite an unbearable memory, has metastasized into empire. The soldiers are marching. The camps are being built. Toller's worst fears are becoming reality. He hangs himself on May 22nd, 1939. He is 45 years old. His papers, examined later, include scattered references to his time in Landsberg. One fragment reads, "I reminded him of what he was. He chose to forget, and the world will pay for his forgetting." The glove is long gone. The witnesses are silent or dead. The 36 hours in April 1924 exist now only in fragments, in archival whispers, in the gaps between official history. Hitler's empire will eventually crumble. He will die in a bunker in 1945, the ideology he built collapsing around him. But the cost, millions dead, entire communities erased, a continent destroyed, is the price of his refusal to remember. Fromelles still exists. The battlefield is now a memorial. Tourists visit, read plaques, walk the ground where thousands died. Few know that in a field hospital there, in July 1916, a Jewish soldier shared his bread with a terrified Austrian. Fewer still know that this small act of kindness, years later, would crack open a man who'd built his identity on hate. The glove stayed in Hitler's pocket for a while. Then it was gone. The secret stayed buried. The 20 witnesses carried it to their graves. And the legend never goes anywhere. It just waits for someone to tell it. Some truths are buried. Others just wait. And this one, small, human, unbearable, waited long enough.